President Trump says the United States could abandon peace talks with Russia and Ukraine within days, saying today that the U.S. will, quote, take a pass if there are no signs of progress on a peace deal. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has more.
If for some reason one of the two parties makes it very difficult, we're just going to say you're foolish, you're fools, you're horrible people, and we're going to just take a pass.
President Donald Trump there today saying that the U.S. may soon abandon peace talks if there's no clear progress made on ending the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, his comments come after Secretary of State Marco Rubio was in Paris yesterday, meeting with Ukrainian and European officials for negotiations. This morning, before leaving France, he said that the U.S. could move on if there's no sign of progress on a peace deal.
We're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end. So we need to determine very quickly now, and I'm talking about in a matter of days, whether or not this is doable over the next few weeks. If it is, we're in. If it's not, then we have other priorities to focus on as well.
President Trump still says he's optimistic that a deal can be made, but that it needs to happen more quickly as thousands of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers are dying every week.
On average, 2,500 young people, soldiers. They're not from America. They're not from anywhere else other than Ukraine and Russia. But we want to save these lives. So
Vice President J.D. Vance in Italy today likewise says that he's optimistic the U.S. can put an end to the war.
We do feel optimistic that we can hopefully bring this war, this very brutal war, to a close.
Russia and Ukraine have agreed to a temporary partial ceasefire, not to attack each other's energy infrastructure and at sea. But both sides accuse the other of violating that every day. Now, the White House says that it might abandon negotiations altogether.
Every day, a lot of people are being killed as we talk about, as they play games. So we're not gonna take that, and we'll see. I think we have a good chance of solving the problem, however. Yeah.
European, U.S., and Ukrainian delegations agreed to meet next week in London for more talks focusing on securing a ceasefire. Now, this comes as top Ukrainian officials say that the U.S. and Ukraine yesterday signed a memorandum as a first step towards a rare earths minerals deal. President Trump said that Washington and Kiev would soon finalize the deal next week. And he's previously mentioned that a minerals deal with Ukraine is a means to recoup the roughly $120 billion in military aid that the U.S. sent Ukraine over the past 3 years. Reporting by Jack Bradley, NTD News.
President Trump today announcing a new rule that would make it easier to fire career federal workers involved in policymaking. In a post on Truth Social, Trump says he's directing the Office of Personnel Management to classify these employees as policy/career. The goal of the new label is to ensure that career policymakers will advance the policy interests of the president. The rule traces back to an executive order issued during the first Trump administration titled Schedule F, which sought to reclassify tens of thousands of federal workers who were involved in policymaking. The rule was later revoked by President Biden. Speaking about the reimplementation, President Trump says it will allow the federal government to, quote, run like a business. President Trump calling efforts to bring back Kilmar Abrego Garcia a shame. This after a Maryland senator met with the alleged MS-13 gang member who was deported to El Salvador. The White House today also highlighting a newly surfaced allegation that Garcia was involved in human trafficking. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has more.
They have no interest in that prisoner. That prisoner's record is unbelievably bad.
Speaking in the Oval Office on Friday, President Trump condemns Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen's latest visit to El Salvador seeking to bring back Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Garcia, who lived in Maryland, is an alleged MS-13 gang member that the Trump administration deported to El Salvador in an administrative error, overlooking a court order barring his removal to his home country. The president doubles down on his stance that he should not be brought back to the U.S. and highlights how dangerous the MS-13 gang is.
They kill people with knives because it's more painful. Very famous for the knifing and killing of two young 16-year-old girls walking to school one day, and they sliced them up into little pieces and killed them. That's MS-13.
While Garcia's attorneys deny that he's part of MS-13 and argues that he has no criminal history in the U.S., two separate judges affirmed that Garcia is an MS-13 member. The administration this week released new details, saying he was arrested with two other well-known gang members and had an MS-13 gang symbol. And President Trump today posted a picture showing him with a photo of what he calls MS-13 tattoos on Garcia's knuckles. The president also pointed to Garcia's wife's previous allegation that he repeatedly beat her up.
He punched and scratched her on the eye, left her bleeding after throwing her laptop on the floor. They call him the Maryland man. He's a Maryland father. No, this is a violent person.
The White House today further saying that Garcia was incredibly implicated in human trafficking and human smuggling, as he was once pulled over with 8 people in his car on a 3-day trip with no luggage. The White House Deputy Chief of Staff saying that even if he returns to the U.S., he will be deported again.
If we were to forcibly retrieve him, the irony would be is that because he's here illegally and has a deportation order, he would simply be deported the second time back to El Salvador, because the withholding order that has been so much discussed is no longer valid or enforced because he's a member of a foreign terrorist organization.
The Supreme Court last week asked the Trump administration to facilitate Garcia's return to the U.S. The White House says that's up to El Salvador, whose President Nayib Bukele has made clear that he has no intention of returning what he calls a terrorist. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
The Chinese Communist Party provides a critical lifeline to oppressive regimes worldwide. NTD's Washington correspondent Luis Martinez dives into the link between the CCP and the authoritarian regime in Venezuela.
Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, Vladimir Putin in Russia, and Ali Khamenei in Iran are at the center of brutal oppression in their home countries and in their respective regions. One of the main things that these three authoritarian oppressive regimes have in common is the financial, the military, and the technological and diplomatic support that they're receiving from the Chinese Communist Party. Now, in the case of the Venezuelan regime, atop of it sits Nicolás Maduro Moros, who has been indicted by U.S. courts under charges of narco-terrorism, and who, together with Vladimir Padrino Lopez, they lead the Cartel de los Soles, the cartel of the suns, named after the sun-shaped insignia that Venezuelan generals wear on their uniforms. Maduro has been accused of personally negotiating multi-ton shipments of FARC-produced cocaine, directed the Cartel of the Suns to provide military-grade weapons to the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and coordinated with narcotic traffickers in Honduras and other countries to facilitate large-scale drug trafficking across the region. The Chinese Communist Party's support of the Venezuelan regime predates Nicolás Maduro. It was Hugo Chavez who led Venezuela into socialism and forced a single-party rule system. During his reign as leader of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was the Latin American leader who traveled the most to China. And in between 2007 and 2017, the Venezuelan regime secured more than $60 billion in Chinese financing. And during that same period of time, the Venezuelan government bought more than $615 million worth of military equipment. Diplomatically, the Chinese Communist Party helped the Maduro regime gain a seat in the UN Human Rights Council. And the Chinese Communist Party has also used its veto power, the UN Security Council, to block resolutions demanding free and fair elections in Venezuela. And a recent Reuters investigation also revealed that Chinese telecommunications companies are assisting the Maduro regime in setting up its advanced citizen surveillance programs. During the past 4 years, the Chinese Communist Party has been financing the Maduro regime by circumventing U.S. sanctions on Venezuelan oil exports. We now know that Russia's Rosneft, their oil company, is helping Venezuelan shipments travel to Malaysian teapot refineries, where that oil is rebranded as Malaysian and sold to Beijing at discounted prices. Those shipments to Malaysia, though, now have stalled after the Trump administration ordered a 25% tariff on goods from countries buying Venezuelan oil. It is important to note that President Trump has invoked the Alien Enemies Act in response to the presence of Tren de Aragua, also known as TDA, cells here in the United States. Tren de Aragua is a foreign terrorist organization that works in conjunction with the Cartel of the Suns that is led by Nicolás Maduro, who in turn is financed and supported by the Chinese Communist Party. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
So what does the future hold for the United States' involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Joining us now live to discuss those implications is Alp Savimosloy, geopolitical strategist and CEO of Alp Savimosloy Investment. Alp, great to have you with us. Senator Rubio warning the United States could abandon peace efforts in Ukraine within days. This is if no progress is made. What do you make of the timing of this? And is this more of a bargaining chip or a bargaining tool or an actual shift in policy that we're witnessing?
Well, Steve, I think it's clear that we have a consensus on the rare earth minerals deal. And so what we're looking at now is the details of the transaction itself. Now, when we're looking at the wider scope of U.S. involvement, any rare earth minerals deal will involve continued U.S. military support. And so what's important here is to continue to have U.S. intelligence sharing and unified military support for the state of Ukraine, even if it comes at the expense for the state of Ukraine of a rare earth minerals deal.
Now, should the United States continue pursuing these peace negotiations, or would it be more practical right now to refocus on and pull back on internal priorities? And do you think that Trump will ultimately pursue other measures here, like tariffs or perhaps secondary sanctions, to pressure for a peace deal?
What we're looking at is the Trump administration's desire to devote its resources elsewhere. When we're talking about devoting these resources elsewhere, we're referring to the Pacific, we're referring to the threat of Iran, and we are also referring to bringing an end to the conflict in Ukraine. And so from a wider perspective, we have to continue to support Ukraine because the end of the war in Ukraine does not equal an end to wars across the Baltics, across Eastern Europe. And so continued U.S. military intelligence sharing, and at the same time, the deployment of hypersonic missiles in the Black Sea within NATO bases that continue to hold our shared tactical nuclear weapons today, that will be the way in which we contain Russia, and to a larger degree, from the threat of Eurasianism, also contain China as China continues its efforts not just to destabilize the Pacific, but also the European continent.
Now, Secretary Rubio did say that the United States, quote, I'm quoting him, has been helping Ukraine for the past 3 years, and we want it to end, but it is not our war. What role, in your opinion, do you think the U.S. should be playing at this point, and how far should it go to influence the outcome?
Well, it is the U.S.'s war. When we're looking at the war in Ukraine, it is a larger war. It is a war between Atlanticism and Eurasianism. Atlanticism with regard to the US, Atlanticism with regard to NATO, and Eurasianism with regard to the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. And so when we're looking at the implications of what will come subsequently to the end of the war in Ukraine, it sets a precedent for future conflicts. Therefore, it is the US's war, but at the same time, Europe has to do more. Europe has to develop a cohesive military, a cohesive unified military. It has to devote further resources to defending Ukraine, because this conflict is not just a conflict that concerns the borders of Ukraine. To a wider degree, it also concerns the borders of current EU nations.
Now, just to be clear, what is your logic in terms of classifying it the U.S.'s war in terms of NATO when neither party involved is a NATO member?
Well, if we're looking at it from a perspective of military policy, let's just look at our bases in the Black Sea. Now, if we're looking at our bases in Romania, if we're looking at our bases in Turkey, currently in Turkey, we house tactical nuclear weapons. And having Russian supremacy in the Black Sea is a non-negotiable option for us in NATO and a non-negotiable option for the US. US policy with regard to NATO continues to be with regard to securing US interests abroad. And so Ukraine, even though it's not a NATO ally, is doing its utmost with regard to countering one of our largest threats, which happens to be the Russian Federation. Now, we have to also recognize that the Russian Federation, in conjunction with the People's Republic of China, seeks to destabilize the US by going after its allies. And that includes NATO allies, and to a lesser degree, it also includes Ukraine in this regard. And so it is the US's war because US interests are concerned. And we can see that by the desire that's come from the Trump administration and Senator Rubio in securing the rare earth minerals deal with President Zelensky.
Alp Savimossoy, really appreciate you joining us.
Pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.